Something sits at the back of the throat, and 3, 4, 10 times an hour you tried to clear it. Swallowing cannot fully remove it, and coughing only temporarily shifts it. Mucus that appeared gradually somewhere after 50, thicker in the morning, thinner by noon, returning by evening in a pattern so consistent you could set a clock by it. At 30, the throat was clear between meals, clear between conversations, clear through the night. At 60, the first 15 minutes of every morning begin with the throat asking for help. Most people assume overproduction, too much mucus, the body manufacturing something it should not, and the response follows the assumption: decongestants to dry the tissue, antihistamines to suppress secretion, steroid sprays to reduce the output. Every intervention targeting production, every intervention assuming the factory is the problem. Your airway, from the deepest bronchi to the back of the throat, is lined with a mechanical transport system operating at the microscale. Millions of hair-like projections beat in a coordinated wave, carrying everything the lungs need removed upward toward the throat at a transport speed of 5 millimeters per minute. A continuous blanket of mucus rides this wave like cargo on a belt, collecting bacteria, dust, viral particles, pollen, and fungal spores along the way and delivering them to the pharynx for unconscious swallowing into the stomach, where gastric acid at a pH of 1.5 to 2 destroys the pathogens on contact. At peak capacity, this transport system ran faster than mucus could accumulate. After 50, every component of this transport system has decelerated, thickened, or lost the chemical signal that maintained its designed operating speed. One pattern runs through all of it: the production rate held steady while the removal rate dropped. What you feel at the back of your throat each morning is the widening gap between how fast mucus arrives and how fast the machinery carries it away. And what widened the gap was several failures running simultaneously, each operating through a different physical mechanism, each compounding the others across the same decades. You notice the symptom appearing. The physics of why that gap opens, what controls the transport speed, and what accelerates the decline, is a mechanical engineering problem operating inside every centimeter of your airway, every surface of your respiratory tract, from the bronchi branching deep inside the lungs to the upper reaches of the nasal cavity, is covered in a continuous carpet of microscopic projections called cilia. Each one is approximately 6 to 7 micrometers long, roughly 1/10 the width of a human hair, anchored to the epithelial cell surface by a structure called a basal body. They are packed densely, approximately 200 per cell across billions of ciliated cells, and they beat in a coordinated pattern that produces a visible wave when observed under magnification. Now that wave has a name in fluid dynamics: a metachronal wave. The physics is the same as a stadium wave, where spectators stand and sit in sequence to create the illusion of motion traveling through the crowd. Each cilium beats at its own frequency, 12 to 15 complete cycles per second, but the timing is staggered so that each one is slightly out of phase with its neighbor. If all cilia beat in unison, they would push fluid in one collective heave and then all recover together, creating a pulsing, inefficient motion. The phase offset converts billions of individual oscillations into a single continuous traveling wave that moves in one direction, upward, from the lower airways toward the pharynx. The coordination requires no central controller, no nerve signal orchestrating the timing. Hydrodynamic coupling between adjacent cilia, the fluid drag each beating cilium creates on its neighbors, entrains the phase relationship automatically. The physics organizes itself. Wave efficiency depends on the number of cilia participating. 200 per cell, billions of cells, each contributing one oscillating element to the collective pattern. When the wave runs at full strength, transport is smooth and continuous, mucus gliding upward in a steady stream. When cilia drop out of the wave through damage, through chemical disruption, through the frequency decline that reaches every ciliated surface after 30, the wave develops gaps. Patches of slower or absent beating create eddies in the mucus flow, small regions where cargo stalls before being picked up by the next functional patch downstream. Transport still works, but the speed drops and accumulation at the delivery point begins. Your kitchen sink has a drain you have never thought about. Water enters, water leaves, the basin stays empty. The drain earns no attention precisely because it keeps pace with the tap. The moment it slows, the basin fills and the drain becomes the only thing you notice. Your airways conveyor has been operating on that principle your entire life, handling the full daily load without producing a single moment of awareness. The moment the conveyor slows, the mucus pools at the delivery point. And what was invisible becomes the one thing you notice every morning, every evening, every hour. The gap between arrival and removal widens enough to register at the pharynx. Every time you breathe through your nose, your breath passes over this wave. The air you inhale travels downward through the nasal cavity, past the trachea, into the bronchi. The mucus blanket travels in the opposite direction, upward, carrying the debris the inhaled air deposited on the way in. Two streams moving in opposite directions through the same tube, one gaseous and one liquid, and the liquid one powered entirely by the wave beneath it. You are never aware of the upward stream. You feel the air going in and out. You do not feel the mucus going up. Everything trapped in the mucus blanket rides this wave. Bacteria inhaled during a breath on a crowded train, dust particles from a construction site 3 blocks away, viral particles suspended in the aerosol of a cough across a room, pollen grains entering the nose during a morning walk, all of it embedded in the sticky upper surface of the mucus blanket, all of it moving upward at the designed transport speed, all of it arriving at the pharynx where it is swallowed unconsciously into the stomach. You swallow approximately 600 times per day, and the majority of those swallows carry a bolus of mucus from the conveyor's delivery point into the acid bath below. 1 liter of contaminated fluid per day, transported from the deepest airways to the stomach, processed and destroyed, without a single moment of conscious awareness. When clearance runs at peak, mucus never pools at the pharynx between swallows. The entire system operates below the threshold of perception, but a conveyor that runs at speed is only half the engineering. What surface does the cargo ride on, and what fluid does the machinery operate within? Those turn out to be 2 separate layers with 2 different physical properties, and the transport works only when both hold their designed depth and viscosity. Your airway's mucus blanket is 2 layers, separated by their physical properties into 2 distinct fluid environments stacked one on top of the other. A thin, watery fluid sits directly on the cell surface where the cilia are anchored, approximately 7 micrometers deep, roughly the height of the cilia themselves. This layer provides a low-viscosity bath. The cilia can swing through freely. Minimal drag, minimal resistance, free range of motion. Depth matters precisely. Too shallow and the cilia tips scrape against the heavier layer above on every stroke, wasting energy. Too deep, and the tips cannot reach that heavier layer when they need to push it. That calibrated depth is maintained by active ion transport across the epithelial cell membrane, regulating water content continuously, holding the fluid film at the exact thickness the machinery requires. Floating above this watery bed is the gel layer, a thick viscoelastic mucus blanket with the consistency of raw egg white. Bacteria, dust, and viral particles adhere to it on contact, trapped in a viscoelastic matrix that holds them until the conveyor delivers the entire surface to the pharynx for disposal. Here is the engineering problem the dual-layer architecture solves. Cilia need to push the gel forward without pulling it backward on the return swing. They need to operate a ratchet, a one-directional transport mechanism, inside a fluid environment where every push in one direction would normally create an equal pull in the opposite direction. 2 fluids with 2 different viscosities defeat that symmetry through an asymmetry in the stroke itself. Each cilium beats in 2 distinct phases. The forward phase, the power stroke, is fast and stiff. The cilium extends to its full height. Its tip pierces upward into the gel layer above, catches the viscous surface, and pushes the gel forward with a rapid sweeping motion lasting approximately 1/3 of the beat cycle. Gel resists being pushed through because it is thick enough to transfer the force. Forward stroke does the work. Recovery is different. The cilium curls close to the cell surface, sweeping back through the thin watery layer below, sliding through the low viscosity fluid without its tip ever reaching the gel above. Recovery takes approximately 2/3 of the cycle, longer than the power stroke, because the cilium must return to its starting position without undoing the forward push it just delivered. Speed asymmetry and height asymmetry combine. Forward is fast, tall, and catches the gel. Recovery is slow, low, and misses it entirely. An escalator captures the principle. Steps grip your shoes on the way up, carrying you forward. On the return loop underneath, the steps travel back to the bottom, carrying nothing, hidden beneath the platform where no passenger can be pulled backward. Cilia grip the gel on the power stroke and release through the watery layer on the recovery stroke. Forward transport on every cycle, 0 backward transport, net movement continuous, unidirectional, upward. The direction never reverses because the stroke asymmetry is built into the molecular structure of each cilium. Each beat burns adenosine triphosphate, the universal fuel every cell runs on. Inside the cilium, 9 pairs of protein rods arranged in a ring are connected by molecular motors called dynein, and each motor slides its rod pair against the next, bending the cilium through the precise arc the asymmetric stroke requires. This dual-layer architecture, which fluid dynamicists call the sol-gel system, was characterized by Button and colleagues in the Journal of Clinical Investigation. The periciliary sol layer acts as a lubricant bath for ciliary motion, while the gel layer above acts as the transport surface for trapped particles. 2 viscosities, 2 functions, 1 integrated machine operating across every centimeter of ciliated airway surface 24 hours a day at the microscale. The system you never knew was there. You have been running this machine your entire life, and it never once asked for your attention. Every breath you took in a dusty room, every walk through pollen season, every hour in a crowded space breathing recycled air, the conveyor caught what the lungs could not tolerate and carried it upward for disposal. The mucosal immune system gets the attention. The mechanical system does the volume. But a machine with this level of precision has a vulnerability that simpler systems avoid. The more precisely calibrated each component, the less tolerance the entire system has for drift. When any component shifts from its specification, the system does not degrade gracefully. It accumulates at its delivery point, and the accumulation becomes the symptom you cannot explain. So what changed after 50? Cilia beat frequency declines with age. Approximately 1% per year after 30, a rate that Gudis and colleagues measured using high-speed video microscopy of human nasal biopsies published in the Laryngoscope. At 30, cilia beat at their peak frequency, 12 to 15 cycles per second. By 40, the frequency has dropped to roughly 90% of peak. By 50, 80%. By 60, the conveyor is running at approximately 70% of its operating specification. By 70, closer to 60, that annual decline sounds trivial in any single year. Across 3 decades, it produces a system operating at a speed its architecture was never designed to sustain. The metachronal wave that coordinated billions of cilia into a smooth traveling wave at peak frequency becomes a slower, less efficient wave at 10 or 11 Hz. Each beat cycle takes longer. Each forward stroke catches the gel for a shorter relative duration because the timing ratios shift as the overall frequency drops. The wave itself changes character. Where it once moved with the smooth continuity of a well-coordinated stadium, it now stutters. The phase relationships between neighboring cilia are losing their precision as the individual frequencies scatter. Mucus, that once traversed from the lower bronchi to the pharynx in hours, now takes measurably longer to make the journey. Dynein motor proteins driving each beat degrade with oxidative stress accumulated over decades of continuous operation. Microtubule pairs within each cilium lose structural integrity as their protein components accumulate damage that cellular repair cannot fully reverse. Each cilium still beats, more slowly, with less force, catching the gel with less grip on each power stroke. Individual cilium degradation and collective wave degradation feed one outcome: slower transport. Goblet cells and submucosal glands that secrete mucus do not decline on a matching schedule. Production holds approximately steady across the decades. The factory keeps shipping at the same rate. The conveyor carrying the shipments away has slowed. Each year, the gap between production and clearance widens by the annual rate. Invisible at first, unnoticeable through the 30s and 40s, detectable as an occasional throat clear in the early 50s, persistent by the 60s. Imagine a checkout line where customers arrive at a constant rate, 1 per minute, and the cashier processes 1 per minute. The line never grows. Reduce the cashier's speed to 70%, processing 1 customer every minute and a half, while arrivals continue at 1 per minute. Within 30 minutes, a queue of 10 customers is formed. Customers accumulating in the line are the mucus pooling at your pharynx. The cashier slowed down. The queue is the reason you clear your throat. And the queue grows longer with each passing year because the cashier is still decelerating, losing another percentage point of processing speed with every trip around the sun. Accumulation concentrates at the pharynx, where the conveyor delivers its cargo for swallowing. When clearance runs near peak, Mucus arrives in small quantities, swallowed between breaths, never pooling long enough to register. When clearance drops to the age-reduced rate, mucus pools between swallows. What sits at the back of the throat is the pooling. The sensation is most pronounced where the nasal conveyor and the lower airway conveyor converge at the pharyngeal wall, the junction where two streams of mucus arrive from different directions, and both must be swallowed through a single narrow passage. Throat clearing is the manual override, a forced expiratory blast that temporarily clears the accumulate mucus from the pharyngeal surface. Temporarily because the conveyor is still running slow and the mucus reaccumulates within minutes. Clearing that repeats 10 times an hour is the gap between production and clearance made audible. Those numbers rearranged my own morning arithmetic. 15 minutes of clearing before the throat settles is the time a decelerating conveyor needs to process 8 hours of overnight accumulation. The body is doing the maintenance it can manage. The speed simply changed. But what if something simultaneously accelerated production while the clearance was already falling behind? You now know the conveyor, the dual-layer engineering, and the annual decline that widens the gap every year. The question shifts from what slowed down to what happens when acid reaches a surface it was never designed to contact. Well, the condition is gastric acid reaching the larynx and pharynx without classic heartburn symptoms. Laryngopharyngeal reflux operates below the sensory threshold of the esophagus but above the damaged threshold of the laryngeal tissue. The esophagus is lined with a mucosa adapted to withstand brief acid exposure, equipped with peristaltic clearance and bicarbonate secretion that neutralize the occasional reflux event. The larynx has none of these adaptations. Its epithelium is designed for air and phonation, not chemical defense. Where the esophagus can tolerate a pH of 4 and clear it within seconds, the laryngeal epithelium sustains damage at that concentration without triggering any sensory alarm the brain would recognize as reflux. You feel none of the classic reflux symptoms, no heartburn or chest burning. Acid arrives silently, producing two consequences. You register days or weeks later, persistent mucus and a hoarse morning voice that clears within an hour of rising. What does the acid do to the clearance equation? Two things simultaneously. First, the laryngeal glands detect chemical irritation and respond with emergency mucus overproduction, flooding the contacted surface with a protective layer, the way your eyes flood with tears and smoke. Production surges above the baseline that age had already matched against a slowing conveyor. Second, acid reaching the sole layer, the thin watery fluid the cilia beat through, alters its chemical environment. Ciliary molecular motors, the dynein proteins driving each beat, function optimally within a narrowed pH range. Acidification shifts the environment outside that range, reducing the force and frequency of each beat cycle. Cilia beat less effectively in acidified fluid. Production up, clearance down. Silent reflux doubles the gap that age widened year by year. Kaufman identified this silent reflux pattern through laryngoscopic examination of patients with chronic throat clearing and no history of heartburn, reporting in the laryngoscope that the majority of chronic throat clearers without reflux symptoms showed visible laryngeal signs of acid contact. If you have tried every decongestant, every antihistamine, every steroid spray, and the clearing still persists, you may have untreated acid reaching a surface already running at reduced clearance. Every treatment targeted production. The source was arriving from below. Persistent postnasal drip unresponsive to allergy treatment. A chronic cough unresponsive to asthma inhalers. A hoarse voice unresponsive to voice rest. All three are documented presentations of silent reflux in patients with no reflux history. The acid exposure is invisible to the patient and often invisible to the physician until a laryngoscope reveals the reddened, oedematous tissue the acid leaves behind. And then, timing matters. Late eating means the lower esophageal sphincter, the muscular valve separating the stomach from the esophagus, relaxes during sleep while the stomach still contains food and acid. Gastric acid at a pH of 1.5 to 3.5 reaches the larynx during the supine hours, the hours when the mucociliary conveyor is already running at its slowest because overnight dehydration has begun thickening the sole layer. Nocturnal silent reflux drives overnight mucus overproduction into a system already decelerating from two directions. You wake with the thickest mucus sensation of the day. The morning voice is hoarse because the vocal folds have been sitting in acid mist for hours. Finishing the last meal at least 3 hours before lying down allows the stomach to empty before the sphincter relaxes, reducing overnight acid exposure that drives both the production surge and the ciliary damage simultaneously. The 3-hour buffer is the time the stomach needs to pass its contents to the small intestine, verified by gastric emptying studies. Anything less than that leaves residual acid and partially digested food in the stomach when gravity is no longer helping the sphincter hold its seal. Dehydration physics connects directly to the sole layer that makes the entire conveyor possible. Sole layer viscosity determines how freely the cilia can beat. Dehydration thickens as fluid. Cilia beating through a thicker sole encounter increased viscous resistance on every stroke, the way stirring a spoon through honey requires more effort than stirring through water. Each beat cycle moves less gel against the increased drag. The drag scales with viscosity, and viscosity scales with the water content of the fluid. Even a modest increase in sole layer viscosity, the kind a few hours without water produces, measurably reduces the distance the gel moves per beat. Overnight dehydration is the largest sustained fluid loss in any 24-hour cycle. 300 to 500 milliliters of water leave the body during sleep through respiration and insensible perspiration, and no intake replaces the loss until morning. The sole layer, a fluid film at its target depth with no independent hydration source, thickens as systemic hydration drops across the night. By morning, the periciliary layer across the entire airway is operating at reduced depth and increased viscosity. Cilia, already beating at the age-reduced frequency, are now beating through a fluid that resists their motion more than it did 12 hours ago. Viscosity and transport efficiency do not scale linearly. Doubling the viscosity of the sole layer does not have the transport speed. It reduces it by substantially more, because the recovery stroke begins encountering drag from the thickened sole that the thin, watery version of the layer was supposed to eliminate. The asymmetric stroke, the entire mechanical basis of the ratchet mechanism, begins to fail when the sole layer thickens enough that the recovery stroke can no longer slide through it cleanly. Forward transport per cycle drops. The morning mucus sensation, the thickness that eases gradually over the first hour of the day, is partly a viscosity problem, resolving as the body rehydrates. Morning water intake that the morning routine discussion described as a first step begins restoring sole layer viscosity through systemic rehydration. The mucus sensation easing as hydration reaches the airway epithelium and the sole layer thins toward its operating depth. The first glass of water in the morning serves the airways before it serves the kidneys. So the fluid can be restored, but can the cilia themselves be told to beat faster? Hydration addresses the fluid, and the cilia still need a chemical signal to maintain their beat frequency against the annual decline. My evening meals finish 3 hours before sleep now, and my mornings begin with water before anything else. The sphincter and the sole layer both respond to timing, and both degrade when the timing disappears. A molecule the body produces in the paranasal sinuses turns out to be one of the strongest stimulants of ciliary beat rate the airway receives. Nitric oxide, the vasodilatory gas produced continuously in the sinus epithelium, activates a signaling cascade inside ciliated cells. The gas reaches the epithelial surface, activates an enzyme called guanylate cyclase, which increases a second messenger called cyclic GMP, which accelerates the molecular machinery driving each dynein motor through its beat cycle. The cascade runs from gas contact to accelerated beating in seconds. Jane and colleagues demonstrated in the American Journal of Respiratory Cell and Molecular Biology that nasal nitric oxide exposure increases cilia beat rate by 10 to 15% above baseline. A conveyor running at the age-reduced rate, receiving nitric oxide through nasal breathing, accelerates miserably. The gap between production and clearance narrows with every nasal breath that carries the gas from the sinus chambers to the ciliated airway surface. Mouth breathing bypasses the sinus chambers entirely. Air entering through the mouth takes the direct route to the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, collecting none of the nitric oxide the sinuses produce continuously. Cilia beat at their baseline frequency without the chemical boost nasal breathing provides. During sleep, when nasal congestion or simple jaw relaxation opens the mouth as the default airway, the ciliary stimulus disappears for the entire overnight period, the hours when the conveyor most needs the help. Bypassing the sinus factory costs the lungs their vasodilatory gas, a cost measured in pulmonary vascular resistance. The The ciliary cost runs in parallel, the conveyor loses its accelerant during the hours it runs slowest. Two losses through one open mouth, operating through entirely independent mechanisms on independent tissue surfaces, compounding the overnight deceleration from dehydration and reduced metabolic drive. By morning, the cilia have been beating without their chemical accelerant for 8 hours through a sole layer thickened by dehydration at a baseline frequency already reduced by 3 decades of annual decline. Every overnight factor compounds against the same system. The morning throat clears, the sound of all three arriving at the delivery point simultaneously. 8 hours of compounding decline resolved in the first 15 minutes of the day. Well, the humming discussion described a 60-second protocol that drains accumulated sinus mucus through acoustic oscillation of the air column inside the sinus cavities. What that discussion did not reach is a second downstream effect. Nitric oxide swept from the sinuses during humming travels down the nasal airway and reaches the ciliated epithelial surface, where it activates the guanylate cyclase cascade that accelerates ciliary beat frequency. If you hummed for the sinus drainage benefit, you were simultaneously accelerating the mucociliary conveyor without knowing it. Sinus clearance and airway clearance linked through one molecule, through one action, operating simultaneously on two different tissue surfaces. The sinus empties because acoustic oscillation drives the fluid through the ostia. The airway conveyor speeds up because the gas that rode with the fluid reaches the cilia and tells them to beat faster. You never noticed the conveyor at 30 because it was faster than the problem. You notice it now because the problem is faster than the conveyor. Every component still answers the signals it was built to receive. The frequency responds, the fluid responds, the sphincter responds. When the conveyor runs at full speed, the throat stays clear, the mucus invisible, the engineering silent. When it slows, you notice nothing else. The clearing you hear each morning is the sound of a system still transporting, still delivering, still doing the work it was built for, at a speed the decades reduced. The engineering remains.